rain didn't just fall that night, it waged war. On the night of October 26, 1982, the sky over the quiet, affluent suburb of Crestwood Hills split open, unleashing a torrent that hammered against rooftops and turned manicured lawns into muddy swamps. Wind howled through the skeletal branches of autumn trees, a mournful symphony accompanying the relentless percussion of the storm. It was the kind of night where decent people locked their doors, drew their curtains, and thanked God for the warmth of their homes. It was the kind of night that was perfect for hiding a scream. Inside the stately colonial house at 112 Willow Lane, Dr. Richard Hale lay on the Persian rug of his study, a place that had always been his sanctuary. But on this night, it had become his tomb. His eyes, once sharp and intelligent, were wide and vacant, staring up at a ceiling he could no longer see. There was a stillness about him that was more profound than sleep, an absolute finality that the storm outside seemed to mock with its chaotic energy. His wife, Eleanor Hale, was the one who found him. Her shriek was a thin, sharp thing, swallowed almost immediately by a deafening clap of thunder that shook the very foundations of the house. The first officers on the scene, Detectives Frank Miller and a young, green-behind-the-ears Tom Peterson, found a scene that was both tragic and utterly bewildering. Frank, a veteran of 20 years with a weary face and a gut that strained the buttons of his tweed jacket, had seen his share of death. But this was different. Dr. Hale was a pillar of the community, a respected cardiologist at Crestwood General, a man known for his calm demeanor and steady hands. He was not the type of person who ended up murdered in his own home. The study was immaculate, almost unnervingly so. Books on cardiovascular medicine lined the mahogany shelves, each in its proper place. A half-finished game of chess sat on a small table near the fireplace, the ivory pieces poised for a move that would never be made. A glass of scotch sat on the edge of the large oak desk, a single ice cube slowly dissolving within the amber liquid, leaving no condensation on the polished wood. Nothing was stolen. Dr. Hale's wallet, thick with cash, was untouched in his jacket pocket. His expensive gold watch was still strapped to his wrist. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no shattered glass, and most puzzling of all, there was no sign of forced entry. Every window was locked from the inside, the deadbolt on the front door was engaged, and the back door was secured with a chain. The killer, it seemed, had either been invited in or had vanished into thin air like a phantom. The initial investigation churned forward with a grim sense of purpose. Frank Miller, methodical and world-weary, led the charge. He and Peterson started with the grieving widow. Eleanor Hale, wrapped in a cashmere blanket and sipping a brandy her neighbor had forced into her trembling hands, was a portrait of shattered elegance. Her story was simple, almost too simple. She and Richard had eaten a quiet dinner together. He'd seemed distracted, she said, but that wasn't unusual. He was often preoccupied with his work, his research. After dinner, he'd retreated to his study to review some patient files, as he often did. She went upstairs to read and eventually fell asleep to the sound of the rain. She woke hours later, realizing the bed beside her was still empty. A knot of unease had tightened in her stomach. When she came downstairs, she found him. Her alibi was flimsy. She was in the house, asleep. But there was no motive they could find. The Hales were wealthy, respected, their marriage seemingly stable, if a bit cool and distant, as was common among couples of their standing who had been together for decades. The detectives turned their attention to Dr. Hale's professional life. They interviewed his colleagues at Crestwood General, a parade of doctors and nurses who spoke of him in hushed, reverent tones. He was brilliant. A pioneer in experimental surgical techniques, he was a mentor to some, a rival to others, but respected by all, or so they said. Peterson, ever the eager rookie, sensed something beneath the surface of the polite condolences. He noticed the way Dr. Alastair Finch, the hospital's ambitious chief of surgery, praised Hale's work while his eyes held a competitive glint. He saw the flicker of fear in the eyes of a young research assistant, a woman named Clara Jenkins, when she was asked if Dr. Hale had any enemies. But these were just feelings, whispers in the dark, nothing concrete. Dr. Hale was involved in a cutting-edge research project, a new type of heart valve. It was controversial, high-stakes work, funded by a powerful pharmaceutical corporation. Could a professional dispute have turned deadly? It was a possibility, but the world of academic medicine was one of scathing journal articles and funding battles, not typically murder. The rumor mill of a small town began to grind, producing its usual grist of speculation and scandal. Whispers of a hidden affair surfaced. Dr. Hale was a handsome, distinguished man. Had he been unfaithful? The detectives followed the lead, a thankless task that involved discreet inquiries and navigating the delicate social circles of Crestwood Hills. They found a lead, a series of quiet lunches with a woman, a gallery owner from the city. But the woman was devastated by his death, her grief seemingly genuine. She admitted to a deep affection for Richard, but she insisted their relationship was platonic, a meeting of minds. Without more, it was another dead end. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The forensic science of 1982 offered little help. The crime scene had been wiped clean, almost surgically so. No usable fingerprints were found, save for those of Richard and Eleanor. The cause of death was determined to be a single, precise stab wound to the heart, delivered with a thin, sharp instrument that was never recovered. The medical examiner noted that the wound was inflicted with an unusual degree of precision, almost as if by someone with anatomical knowledge. Someone like a doctor. But that cast suspicion on half the people they had interviewed. The storm had washed away any potential tracks outside. The murderer had come and gone like a ghost, leaving only a dead body and 1,000 unanswered questions. The investigation stalled, the files grew thicker, but the answers remained stubbornly out of reach. Frank Miller retired a few years later, the Hale case a permanent, frustrating blot on an otherwise distinguished career. Tom Peterson was promoted, moved on to other cases, other horrors. The murder of Dr. Richard Hale became a local legend, a ghost story told in hushed tones, a chilling reminder that some secrets refused to be unearthed. The case went cold, frozen in time, buried under the weight of 3 decades of silence. 30 years later, in the autumn of 2012, the rain was falling again over Crestwood Hills. It was a soft, melancholic drizzle, a far cry from the violent deluge of that night in 1982. But it was enough to stir the ghosts of the past. Detective Sarah Monroe stood in the cold, cavernous space of the county's evidence archives, a place where old tragedies went to be forgotten. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decaying paper. She ran a gloved finger over a cardboard box. The black stenciled letters faded but still legible. Hale, Richard. Homicide, 1982. Sarah was different from the detectives who had first worked this case. She was part of a new generation, one that had grown up with DNA analysis, digital forensics, and the unshakable belief that there was no such thing as a perfect crime. As the newest member of the county's cold case squad, she had been given the thankless task of reviewing the department's most notorious failures. The Hale case was at the top of the list. She spent the first week doing nothing but reading. She immersed herself in the original case files, the binders filled with yellowing, typewritten pages. She studied the crime scene photos, the black and white images capturing a sterile, bloodless horror. She read the transcripts of the interviews with Eleanor Hale, with Dr. Finch, with the timid research assistant Clara Jenkins. She felt like she was having a one-sided conversation with ghosts. The original detectives, Miller and Peterson, had been thorough. They had followed every lead, no matter how tenuous, but they had been limited by the technology of their time. Sarah, however, had tools they could only have dreamed of. She started with the physical evidence, what little there was of it. Most of it was mundane. Clothing fibers, soil samples, the victim's personal effects. But one item caught her eye. It was a small, sealed evidence bag labeled "Fragment of paper found under victim's desk." Inside was a tiny, torn piece of high-quality stationery, no bigger than her thumbnail. On it were 2 handwritten letters, barely legible. "V-me." It had been dismissed at the time as insignificant, a random scrap. But Sarah wondered. Her next step was to request a full review of all biological evidence. The technology had advanced exponentially. In 1982, blood typing was the best they could do. Now, a single skin cell could yield a full DNA profile. She sent Dr. Hale's clothes, the Persian rug he was found on, and the Scotch glass to the state crime lab, hoping for a miracle. While she waited for the results, she decided to revisit the human element of the case. She started by tracking down the key players, or at least those who were still alive. Frank Miller had passed away a decade ago. Eleanor Hale now lived in a high-end nursing home, her mind clouded by the fog of dementia, her memories of that night lost forever. But Tom Peterson, the rookie detective from 1982, was now the retired chief of police, a silver-haired man with weary eyes that had seen too much. Sarah met him for coffee at a diner that hadn't changed much since the 80s. "The Hale case," Peterson said, stirring his coffee with a slow, deliberate motion. "That one was a career maker, or a career breaker. For me, it was just a shadow. It followed me for years." He recounted the details of the investigation, his memory still sharp. He spoke of the baffling crime scene, the lack of a motive, the wall of silence he and Miller had hit. "Everyone we talked to seemed to be hiding something," he recalled. "Not necessarily about the murder, but something. It was a town of secrets, Crestwood Hills, still is." He told her about his suspicions of Dr. Finch, the ambitious surgeon. Finch wanted Hale's job, his research, his prestige. He was a cold fish, that one, but we could never prove anything. He also mentioned the research assistant, Clara Jenkins. She was terrified of what I never figured out. She left town a few months after the murder, just packed up and disappeared. Sarah's next stop was Crestwood General Hospital. It had been renovated and expanded over the years, but the old wing where Dr. Hale had worked still stood. Dr. Alistair Finch was still there, now a world-renowned surgeon with a corner office and a steely gray mane of hair. He was polite, almost charming, but his eyes were like chips of ice. He expressed a practiced sympathy for his long-dead colleague. "Richard was a genius," Finch said, his voice smooth and measured. "A true visionary. His death was a tremendous loss to the medical community." When Sarah pressed him about their rivalry, he gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "Professional competition is healthy. It pushes us to be better. Richard and I respected each other immensely. He was a fortress of professional courtesy, impenetrable." But as Sarah was leaving his office, she noticed a framed photograph on his credenza. It was a picture of a younger Dr. Finch standing on a sailboat with a group of other men. One of them, smiling broadly at the camera, was a prominent local politician from that era, a man named Marcus Thorne, who had been a major benefactor of the hospital. The pieces were disparate, unconnected, but they were starting to form a picture in Sarah's mind, the edges still blurry. The frightened research assistant, the ambitious rival, the powerful politician, and the controversial medical research. Sarah decided to dig deeper into the heart valve project. She spent days in medical libraries and online archives, pulling up articles and papers from the early 80s. The project had been hailed as a breakthrough, but she found whispers of problems, rumors of failed trials, of data being suppressed. The pharmaceutical company that had funded it, a corporate giant called OmniMed, had abruptly pulled its funding a month before Hale's murder, citing unforeseen complications. The project was shelved and its data was sealed under a non-disclosure agreement. Then she got the call from the crime lab. It was the miracle she had been hoping for. They had found something. On the Scotch glass, the one that had sat on Dr. Hale's desk, they had isolated a partial DNA profile. It didn't belong to Richard or Eleanor Hale. It was from an unknown male. It wasn't enough for a direct match in the national database, but it was a start. Even more intriguing was what they found on the Persian rug, deep within the fibers, right next to where Dr. Hale's body had been, a single microscopic drop of blood. It also didn't belong to the victim, and it also belonged to an unknown male. The lab confirmed that the DNA from the glass and the blood droplet came from the same person. The ghost who had walked out of 112 Willow Lane 30 years ago had finally left a calling card. Armed with this new evidence, Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline. The case was no longer cold. It was thawing, breathing. She focused her efforts on finding the missing research assistant, Clara Jenkins. It took weeks of painstaking work, cross-referencing old records and voter registrations, but she finally found her. Clara was living under her married name in a small town in Oregon. She was a retired school teacher, a grandmother with kind eyes and hands that trembled slightly. When Sarah showed up on her doorstep, a wave of fear washed over the older woman's face, a ghost of the same terror Tom Peterson had seen 30 years ago. At first, Clara was reluctant to talk. The past was buried, she said. It was dangerous to dig it up. But Sarah was persistent, gentle but firm. She told her about the new DNA evidence, about her belief that the truth was finally within reach. Slowly, hesitantly, Clara began to talk. Her voice was barely a whisper as she recounted the story she had kept locked away for 3 decades. Dr. Hale was a good man, she began. He was brilliant, but he was also naive. He believed in the purity of science, in helping people. He didn't understand the business of it. She explained that the new heart valve, the one they were working on, had a fatal flaw. In a small percentage of cases, it failed catastrophically after a few years. They had discovered the problem during the animal trials. The data was undeniable. Dr. Hale was devastated. He insisted they halt the project, go public with their findings. But the hospital and the pharmaceutical company, OmniMed, had already invested millions. They were on the verge of FDA approval. A scandal would be ruinous. Dr. Finch, he was the one who dealt with the corporate people, Clara continued, her voice trembling. He told Dr. Hale to be a team player, to think about the hospital's reputation, about the greater good. He said they could fix the flaw in the next generation of the valve. But Dr. Hale wouldn't hear of it. He said it was unethical, that it was murder to knowingly implant a faulty device into a human heart. The pressure on Dr. Hale had been immense. He was threatened with lawsuits, with the destruction of his career. But he wouldn't back down. He started compiling his own set of data, a secret report that detailed the cover-up. He planned to leak it to a medical journalist. The week before he died, Clara whispered, her eyes filling with tears, he told me he had finished the report. He told me he had hidden a copy just in case something happened to him. He was scared. I was scared for him. On the night of the murder, Clara had received a frantic phone call from Dr. Hale. It was just before dinner. He sounded agitated. He just said 2 words to me, she recalled. They know. Then the line went dead. Terrified, Clara had packed her bags and left town the next day, convinced that whoever had killed Dr. Hale would come for her next. She had spent the last 30 years looking over her shoulder. Clara's story was the key, the Rosetta Stone that translated all the cryptic clues. The motive wasn't personal, it was professional. It wasn't a crime of passion, it was a corporate execution. Dr. Hale was murdered to silence him, to protect a massive conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the medical establishment and the corporate world. Sarah now had a clear direction. She needed to find Dr. Hale's hidden report. Clara had no idea where he might have concealed it. Sarah went back to the source, to the house on Willow Lane. It had been sold several times over the years, but she got permission from the current owners to conduct a search. She spent an entire day in the study, which was now a child's playroom. She ran her hands along the bookshelves, tapped on the walls, looked for any sign of a hidden compartment. Nothing. Dejected, she was about to leave when her eyes fell upon the old chessboard, which the current owners had kept as a curiosity. It was the one from the original crime scene photos. On a whim, she picked up one of the white knights. It felt slightly heavier than it should. She twisted the base. With a soft click, it came apart in her hands. Tucked inside the hollowed-out base was a tightly rolled-up piece of microfilm. Back at the station, Sarah viewed the microfilm under a magnifier. It was everything Clara had described and more. It was Dr. Hale's report, a meticulous, damning indictment of OmniMed and the hospital administration, including Dr. Alastair Finch. He detailed the flawed data from the heart valve trials, the pressure he was under to falsify his results, and the threats he had received. But there was one more piece of the puzzle. The report mentioned a series of secret payments made by OmniMed through a shell corporation. The payments were funneled to a consultant who was tasked with managing the Hale situation. The consultant was a man named Marcus Thorne, the politician from Dr. Finch's office, who at the time had been a powerful state senator with significant influence over medical regulations. Thorne was the enforcer, the one hired to keep the lid on the scandal. Sarah now had the motive and the conspiracy. All she needed was to tie the DNA to a person. She ran Marcus Thorne's name through the system. He was now a retired, highly respected elder statesman, living a life of quiet luxury. He had no criminal record, so his DNA wasn't on file. She looked at Dr. Finch again. He also had no record. But Sarah had an idea. She remembered Peterson's description of Finch as a cold fish, a man who exuded control and precision. A man who would never be so clumsy as to leave his own blood at a crime scene. But what if the killer wasn't clumsy? What if he was injured? She went back to the original case file, to the ME's report. The fatal wound was delivered with a thin, sharp instrument. But there was another detail, one that had seemed insignificant at the time. Dr. Hale had defensive wounds on his hands, small cuts and abrasions. In his final moments, he had fought back. He must have injured his attacker. Sarah needed a DNA sample from one of her two main suspects, Finch or Thorne. Getting a warrant would be difficult without a direct link, so she resorted to old-fashioned police work. She staked out Dr. Finch's home. After 2 days of watching, she got her chance. Finch, an avid gardener, was tending to his prize-winning roses. He snipped a thorn and pricked his finger, shaking it with a grimace before wrapping it in a handkerchief and tossing it into his curbside trash can. After he went inside, Sarah retrieved the handkerchief. It was a long shot, but it was all she had. She sent it to the lab for a rush comparison. The next 24 hours were the longest of her life. She sat in her office, the microfilm report and the crime scene photos spread out on her desk, the faces of the past staring back at her. The phone rang. It was the lab. The DNA on the handkerchief was a match, not to the blood drop, but to the partial profile on the Scotch glass. Dr. Alistair Finch had been in the study that night. He had stood over his rival's body. He was part of it. But he wasn't the killer. The blood, the DNA of the man who had wielded the weapon was still unidentified. Sarah's mind raced. Finch was there. Why? To ensure the job was done? To retrieve Hale's report? The Scotch glass. The killer had a drink. Finch had a drink. Were there two people? She looked again at the photo of Finch and Marcus Thorne on the sailboat. Powerful men, friends, co-conspirators. Thorne was the muscle, the fixer. It had to be him, but she still had no way to get his DNA. As she stared at the photo, an idea sparked, a desperate, risky idea. She arranged a meeting with Marcus Thorne at his country club, under the pretext of discussing a new police charity initiative. Thorne, ever the public servant, agreed. He was older now, his hair white, but he still possessed an aura of power and unshakable confidence. They sat on a veranda overlooking a pristine golf course. Sarah made small talk for a few minutes before steering the conversation. "I'm also heading up the cold case squad now," she said, watching his eyes carefully. "We've just reopened the Dr. Richard Hale murder from 1982. Thorne's composure was flawless. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of mild interest. "Hale? Yes, I remember that. A terrible tragedy. He was a great asset to the community." He took a sip of his iced tea, his hand perfectly steady. As he set the glass down, Sarah continued. "We've had a breakthrough, actually. New DNA evidence. We found the killer's blood at the scene." She let the words hang in the air. For the first time, she saw a crack in Thorne's armor, a tightening around his eyes, a subtle clenching of his jaw. He said nothing. He simply picked up his glass and took another long, slow sip. And in that moment, Sarah knew. After the meeting, as Thorne walked away, Sarah signaled to a plainclothes officer who had been sitting at a nearby table. The officer walked over to Thorne's table, picked up the iced tea glass with a gloved hand, and placed it carefully into an evidence bag. The lab results came back the next day. It was a perfect match. The DNA from the saliva on the iced tea glass matched the DNA from the drop of blood found on the Persian rug 30 years ago. The ghost had a name, Marcus Thorne. Sarah finally had it all. The motive, the conspiracy, the evidence, the killer. She assembled her case file, the culmination of months of relentless work, a testament to a promise made to a ghost. But as she prepared the arrest warrant, she received an unexpected visitor. It was the retired chief, Tom Peterson. He looked older, more tired than he had at the diner. He closed her office door behind him. "I heard what you've been working on, Sarah," he said, his voice low. "I heard you found something." Sarah nodded, a grim smile on her face. "I found everything, Tom. I got him." Peterson didn't smile back. He sat down heavily in the chair opposite her desk. "Thorne," he said, "it wasn't a question. When we first investigated, we looked at him. He was a benefactor of the hospital, a friend of Finch's. He had an alibi, of course, a political dinner, but we heard whispers, rumors that he was OmniMed's fixer, a man who cleaned up messes." He leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "Frank Miller, my partner, he wanted to push it. He was convinced Thorne was involved. He made some inquiries. 2 days later, Frank had a brick thrown through his living room window. The next week, my daughter was followed home from school. We got the message. We were told, in no uncertain terms by our own superiors, to drop that line of inquiry. We were told the case was going cold. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the weight of decades of corruption. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just about a murder. It was about a system, a web of power and influence that protected its own. They covered it up, she whispered. They all did. Peterson nodded slowly. Thorne is just one piece of it. Finch is another. OmniMed is still one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. The people who were in power back then, their protégés are in power now. You go after Thorne, you're not just going after an old man. You're going after an institution. You'll win the battle, maybe. You'll put him in jail for the few years he has left. But you won't win the war. They will crush you, Sarah. They'll ruin your career, your life. They'll do to you what they did to us. The final scene played out not in a courtroom, but in a quiet, sterile interrogation room. Marcus Thorne sat opposite Sarah, his expensive suit unrumpled, his expression calm, almost serene. Dr. Finch was in the room next door, his composure finally shattered, having already given a full confession in exchange for a deal, betraying his old friend to save himself. Sarah laid it all out for Thorne, the DNA, the microfilm, Finch's testimony. She told him how he and Finch had gone to Hale's house that night, using a key Finch had to retrieve the report. They had tried to reason with him, to threaten him. But Hale wouldn't break. He fought back. And in the struggle, Thorne, in a fit of rage, had stabbed him with a letter opener from Hale's own desk. A precise, fatal blow. They had taken the report, wiped the scene clean, and left, convinced their secret was safe. Thorne listened patiently, a faint, condescending smile on his lips. When she was finished, he didn't deny it. "You're a very good detective, Miss Monroe," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Impressive, but you don't understand how the world works. Richard Hale was going to destroy hundreds of careers, ruin a multi-billion-dollar company, and set medical science back by a decade, all because of his own self-righteous ego. I did what was necessary. I made a difficult choice for the greater good." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers, and they held no remorse, only a chilling certainty. "You have your man. You'll get your conviction. You'll be a hero for a day, but let me give you some advice. Stop digging. You have the truth about what happened that night. Be content with it, because if you keep pulling at this thread, if you try to unravel the whole tapestry, the history I'm a part of, it will repeat itself, and you will find yourself on the wrong side of it." His words were not a threat. They were a statement of fact, a promise delivered with the calm assurance of a man who had never truly lost. Sarah secured the conviction. Marcus Thorne was found guilty of murder and spent the last 18 months of his life in a prison hospital. The story was a local sensation, the final, shocking chapter in a mystery that had haunted Crestwood Hills for a generation. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But Sarah never felt the victory. Thorne's final words echoed in her mind. She knew he was right. She had exposed a killer, but the conspiracy, the system of corruption and silence that had allowed him to flourish for 30 years, remained untouched, hidden in plain sight. Sometimes, late at night, when the rain would fall against her window, she would think of Dr. Richard Hale. She had found the truth for him, but she couldn't change the world that had killed him. The silence of Crestwood Hills was no longer born of ignorance, but of a chilling, shared understanding. And as she looked out into the dark, rain-streaked streets, she couldn't help but wonder how many other secrets the town was keeping, waiting for the next storm to wash them away, or for the next detective brave enough or foolish enough to come looking. The rain kept falling, a steady, quiet rhythm like time itself, washing over the sins of the past, but never truly washing them away.